Hey, good morning. Happy Wednesday. Got my cup of coffee, a little insulated mug to keep it nice and hot. Hope your day is started off well. Hope your week's going well. We're kind of at the midpoint of that week that we have, and I appreciate you spending just a couple minutes with me this Wednesday morning to check in. We are walking through the book of Matthew. We've been doing it for a long time now, it feels like. It's quite a packed book of things that teaches us about who Jesus is and the things that he did. Matthew's firsthand eyewitness account of these events. And we're coming to, as we started last week, the final week in the life of Jesus. It starts on Palm Sunday. We talked about that last week, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where all the crowds on the road cry out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, calls him the Son of David. All of this messianic hope wrapped up in Jesus as he's coming into Jerusalem for one of the main Jewish holidays, the Passover. Many people, hundreds of thousands estimated, coming to Jerusalem to celebrate this memorial, this remembrance, this festival that reminds them of God's faithful deliverance of Israel from Egypt. And we said last week, remember, all of this is happening while Egypt is under the oppression of Rome. So the Passover is a holiday that's pretty tense. It's one that for Rome, they're worried that some of the more militant sides of Israel might try to stage an uprising because it is celebrating God's deliverance. So the hope, and probably the hope that maintained in many people is this the year where God delivers us again? And when Jesus comes in, all of that is focused on him. Not just is this the year, but is this the person who delivers us from Rome, which brings us to his first stop in Jerusalem. Now, it is an unusual stop. If you're following kind of the arc of the story and the expectations of the people, you would think Jesus would go into Jerusalem to confront the oppressing Romans for what they're doing, the mistreatment and the oppression of the people of Israel. But his first stop is not to talk to a Roman leader. His first stop is to go to the temple, which, okay, maybe makes sense as well as a good Jewish man, and as the temple being that symbol of God's presence, God's blessing upon Israel. Of course, at a Passover time, Jesus would want to go to the temple, but it's what that happens in the temple that's so striking, because Jesus goes into the temple and doesn't go to worship, but he goes and he causes quite a scene. Sometimes we call what happens next in the story the cleansing of the temple. Matthew records that he enters the temple and he drives out all those who are buying and selling, and he turns over the table of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. So he comes in and he's like a wrecking ball. Apologies to Miley Cyrus there. Comes in like a wrecking ball and just starts turning over tables and chasing people out. Another one of these Gospels, I think it's John, talks about him forming kind of a whip and kind of cleansing this temple out. It's quite a shocking moment. In fact, some people might look at this and say it's a little out of character of Jesus. We don't see Jesus kind of losing his temper, you might say, in the normal course of his ministry until here. And so what's going on here is kind of the question that's underneath this. Why did this particular scene elicit such a strong reaction in Jesus? And I think we get the hint by the things that Jesus says, because having done this, his next words are in Matthew 21:13, and he quotes from two Old Testament prophets. He says, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers," or a den of thieves. So Jesus kind of gives us a hint what he sees happening here that's so problematic for him. And he, as I said, quotes these two Old Testament prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. Now, both of these prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, part of their prophetic ministry was to Israel to say, look, if you don't straighten up, if you don't start doing right, God is going to punish you. God is going to judge you for your unfaithfulness and for your idolatry. So that, looking at big picture messages of Isaiah and Jeremiah, that's what's underneath those entire Old Testament prophetic books. And Jesus is calling on them because he wants that message to resonate with the people here. Now, what he finds, first of all, let's talk about the Isaiah quote. Isaiah 56 is where he quotes from. He says, my house will be called a house of prayer. Isaiah 56 actually says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And that last part, for all nations, Mark's account has the full quote there. It's pretty important because while we don't maybe understand the layout of the temple, what's happening in Jesus' day is the temple is divided into different places. And the outermost courts, and really the largest part of the temple, is called the court of the Gentiles. If you're familiar with the word, Gentile just means not Jewish. And so in the temple, the Gentiles could only come to this outer part of the temple to worship and to pray. There's a wall that there are signs. We found archaeological relics of this sign that used to hang between the court of the Gentiles and the next inner court of the temple that basically threatened death to any Gentile who crossed over that threshold. This was pretty much a serious thing. So the only place the nations or the Gentiles could come to worship was in this outer court. And this is exactly where, when Jesus gets into the temple, he finds it not full of worshipers, but full of merchants, full of buying and selling. Now you could say, okay, this is an important part because it's a Passover and it requires certain sacrifices. And so because of those sacrifices, there was kind of a market to sell sacrificial animals to the people who came. It might be difficult if you came from a long way to bring your sacrificial animal. And the undercurrent also is that often if you would bring your own animal, the people at the temple would find a reason that it wasn't right. There was some imperfection in it and would require you to buy an animal that was deemed perfect, that was deemed unblemished, that could be used for sacrifice. So put that aside for a minute. So what's happening here is necessary. What has to happen, the changing of money from the normal Roman currency to the shekel of the temple, that would have to happen. And the buying of animals was necessary. But where it was happening seems to be pretty much a problem for Jesus, outside of maybe the overpriced and the bad exchange rate. Where it's happening, because it's preventing people to come to the temple. In fact, if you were to read all of Isaiah 56, you would see that what Isaiah is prophesying is that the temple should be a place, and the nation Israel should be a people that shows the light of the one true God, Yahweh of Israel, to the world, so that they would be drawn to this one true God of Israel to worship him. And Israel had kind of perverted that, and instead of seeing themselves as a draw to the one true God, they were setting up these obstacles that didn't allow anybody else to come in. There were some very much, you might say, some prejudices from the Jewish people to the nations. And so they kind of took it for granted that this was really about them and what they wanted to do, and they didn't care about the nations coming. And Jesus sees this. He says, no, my Father's house, this temple is meant to be, has been created for, and has always meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. And these merchants are getting in the way of the nations coming. And instead of Israel being that example and that light, they're making it more difficult for the nations to come to worship the one true God. So Jesus is not so happy about that. And then he goes on and he says, you've turned it into a den of robbers or a den of thieves. Now this is the Jeremiah quote. Jeremiah chapter 7 is where he's quoting from. And in Jeremiah chapter 7, if you're to read this section, you would find this section of Jeremiah is prophesying the destruction of the temple. And one of the reasons he's prophesying the destruction of the temple is because people are going about their lives with no regard for God, total unfaithfulness, not any sense of God is important, but then they come to the temple and act all holy and righteous. And Jeremiah is saying that is not how this works. You've turned this place of worship, which should be an overflow of your normal lives, into a place where it's kind of a get out of jail free card. I can do whatever I want here, but I come to the temple and that makes everything okay. I do my religious duty and that makes everything okay. And God says through the prophet Jeremiah, you're going to understand that's not okay when I destroy this temple, because you've turned it into a den of robbers, this place of hypocrisy. And Jeremiah has no use for it. By the way, shortly after Jesus enters the temple and cleanses it and says these very words, within a couple of decades, in 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. Rome comes in and destroys the temple. So Jesus reaching back into Jeremiah and pulling it into his day is in that prophetic tradition of saying God's going to keep his word, and you can't keep carrying on this way and expect God to ignore it. He's going to destroy this temple, even though it has only been rebuilt for 300 or 400 years after Ezra Nehemiah came back. The people have not learned their lesson. A fascinating moment here. And I think that's what's at issue. What's the undercurrent for Jesus is the people of Israel were taking for granted God's presence and his blessing. And Jesus is saying, nope, that's not how this works. Just external religious activity is not what it's about. It's about matters of the heart, and God sees that. And his cleansing of the temple is a call to us to evaluate, are we taking some things for granted? Are we going through the motions? Are we just kind of doing the externals, thinking as long as we do the externals enough, God will be happy, instead of realizing God desires continuity, we might say, wholeheartedness, the matching of the inside and the outside. By the way, that's what we've been talking about on Sunday morning. In fact, I think one of the themes of the Sermon on the Mount, which we've been going through on Sunday morning, is this reality of the inside motive has to match the outside behavior. Just because the outside behavior is good, i.e., I'm not killing anybody, I'm not committing adultery, I'm praying or fasting or giving, if the motive is not right, God sees the heart. And so it's a call for Israel, and it's a call for us to evaluate our motives and our heart desire for God. It is a striking moment in Jesus' life and ministry, and it should jump out at us, not giving us permission. I think my kind of pet peeve about this is a lot of people use this to give themselves permission to lose their temper. See, Jesus lost it here. No, I think we miss the point entirely if we find this passage as just an excuse to justify our short fuse. No, Jesus is calling Israel and he's calling us to examine ourselves and to cleanse that which is unhealthy and wrong and to focus on him. Certainly in this leading up to Easter season, we call it Lent, particularly if you're from a more liturgical church, is a great time to examine ourselves and to see if there's anything that needs cleansing. Much like David prayed, create in me a new heart, O God. Psalm 51 prayer of David after his great sin. Well, I'm going to leave it there with you today. I've used up all my time and probably all your time too. Thanks for taking a few minutes with me. Let me finish up my cup of coffee here and I'll let you get back to your day. Love to have you join us. Hope to see you next Wednesday as we touch base together. But Sundays at 9, we'll be here. Love to see you there. Take care.